excessive, wasteful, and imbalanced consumption founded on a fossil fuel-driven economy into a more circular, renewable energy-based economy of low waste. We've heard a lot of those different challenges over the past few days, so I won't go too much into it. But the idea here is that could that provide a new business logic for companies with the purpose of having a more long-term perspective, given a lot of those companies are ultimately dependent on a healthy biosphere as well. And it sounds very appealing. It sounds also a bit dodgy if you look at the legacy of cooperation and when it comes to impacts and engagement with sustainability issues. And that's where, to me, scientists have a critical role to play in this process. As I said, corporate leaders increasingly regard sustainability as key for their business and a chance for companies to add value and to access emerging markets. So the challenge here is not any longer to bring sustainability into the boardroom. It's there. It's more to make sure that the problems are defined based on science rather than what would be convenient for the companies. Like in a book entitled Will Big Business Destroy the Planet? Professor Peter Dovern explained that, taking responsibility does not entail fixing the problem. So I think we need to move beyond companies taking responsibility to actually companies being active stewards towards a more sustainable and equitable future. And that's where scientists come in the picture through the notion of co-production of knowledge. So by co-production of knowledge, it's this idea of, like bringing different expertise and insights together to co-produce knowledge and co-design solution. And there are a few principles, overarching principles of that. The first one is that it has to be context-based very often. So it's important to situate the process in a particular context, place, or issue. Often what works somewhere won't work elsewhere. It has to be pluralistic, and that means explicitly recognizing the multiple ways of knowing and doing. It has to be goal-orientated, to articulate clearly defined, shared, and meaningful goals that are related to the challenge at hand. And it has to be interactive. It's to allow ongoing learning among actors and active engagement of the different stakeholders in the project. And there's a lot of examples of co-production of knowledge between scientists and traditional communities, for instance, or local communities. But there are few examples of science-industry collaboration in the context of sustainability. And as I said, there would be reason why collaboration is an obvious opportunity, but there's also a lot of reason why collaboration is not an obvious opportunity. Why it makes sense is to understand the increasingly complex social ecological landscape that we're facing, whether it's on land or whether it's on ocean. There's complex governance, there's different actors, increasing number of sectors and players at play. Also, there are scientists that already speak the language of business. And I think that's very important to recognize. Like there's a broad field of social science that is dedicated to understanding corporate behavior and the force that shape it. And that field has begun to engage with sustainability science as an approach to solve social and environmental pressure, but it somehow remains isolated from other disciplines and in some cases has struggled to incorporate environmental factors into its frame of reference. Now, why wouldn't that be an obvious opportunity? Well, ultimately, today, companies follow market logic and logistic shareholder and consumer demands, right? So they're interested in short-term returns and profitability. There is the specter of greenwashing and whether those efforts and those engagement would actually lead to change or just reinforce a status quo and even sometimes make matter worse. So there's, of course, reputational risk as well. As scientists, why would you engage with companies? Why would you shake hands with the devil? So for the last few minutes of this talk, I'll just walk you through an experiment that we conducted within a specific sector, which is seafood, and give you a taste of what could those science industry collaboration look like, and that will open up the floor for more discussion. This is something we framed as a global science business initiative for ocean stewardship. So we're going back into the ocean and more specifically into the seafood sector. And to understand it, I think the timeline here shows you that it started actually quite a way back then, back in 2013, with a scientific process, almost curiosity-driven, if I dare to say, that was trying to understand who were the big corporations active in ocean ecosystem. And inspired by the concept of keystone species, that are those species with a disproportionate influence on their environment, we went on and tried to look for keystone actors in marine ecosystem by understanding who were the big companies. Like, again, you see that consolidation trend in the seafood industry that's been referred to as a keystone pattern, which is an asymmetrical distribution of revenues. And when you look at who there are, like companies from across the world, how much they were producing and where and of what, and where did they operate. So together it was a dozen of companies, but involved again in more than 100 countries, close to 1,000 subsidiaries altogether, and handling more than 400 different species. So based on that, we define keystone actors as companies that dominate global production revenues and volumes, that control globally relevant segment of seafood production, that connect ecosystem globally through subsidiaries, and that influence global governance processes and institutions. And a conclusion of the paper was that, well, sustainable leadership by those companies could result in cascading effect throughout the entire seafood industry, given their influence. And what was a speculative conclusion became a hypothesis to actually be tested by engaging with companies. And so that's the second phase of the work, what we refer to as the co-design process, where we engage in dialogues with those companies, first on one-on-one bilateral meetings, ultimately leading to a first keystone dialogue where 8 CEOs of the world's largest seafood companies agreed to join a handful of scientists, 4 of us, to discuss transformative risk and opportunities for the global seafood industry. And here you had the 2 largest seafood companies by revenues, the 2 largest tuna specialists, the 2 largest farmed salmon producers, and the 2 largest aquafeed manufacturers, so different segment of the seafood production. And this first meeting resulted in a statement signed by all 8 CEOs and committing their companies to address a set of 10 different issues in the industry. So 10 commitments, and you'll see some very familiar terms from transparency and traceability to the elimination of forced labor and illegal fishing, a reduction in CO2 emission, engaging in reducing the use of plastic. So some prominent issues in the seafood sector. But it also resulted in the establishment of its own initiative called the Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship. It was perceived as unique because it connected science and business. It connected fisheries and aquaculture, which are too often separate within the seafood industry. And it connected seafood companies all over the world. You had previous initiatives between, let's say, Norwegian salmon farmers, but rarely across the board. So if you look at CBOS today, it's 10 companies, 10 of the world's largest seafood companies, operating in 95 countries, more than 100,000 employees, 400 species, like a conservative estimates of more than 10% of the global catch, and sometimes controlling up to 20 or 40% of some of the most valuable fish population. And the way the initiative has been structured is around a set of 6 task forces. So the commitments by the CEO are operationally addressed in task forces that are led by companies and supported by scientists together with like operational staff within the companies. And this is work based and informed by science, but the priorities and the solution are collaboratively identified and co-designed to make sure that they can be implemented. So from the very first dialogue back in 2016, there's been a series of dialogue over the years following the model of 1 annual CEO meeting and 1 annual operational staff meeting. So more of a working meeting, usually in the spring when the CEO meeting comes in the fall, to prepare and to make sure that things are being done and then brought back to the CEOs. And it took time, right? It started in 2016, we're in 2021, and it's only last year that the CEOs within CBOS agreed to time-bound goals for a healthy ocean. So what was first aspirational commitments without any time-bound goal became time-bound goal in December 2020, with the first reporting happening already this fall. And this is becoming much more tangible in terms of targets, reporting, disclosure, and reduction in CO2 emissions. So it's actually starting to move the needle after 5 years of work. So maybe one lesson here is that transformation takes time, but it does happen eventually. Finally, a few overarching lessons learned before opening to the floor. Is that, as I said, like a shared vision, a long-term perspective, and trust is instrumental. I think what was critical for the establishment of that science industry collaboration and that aspiration of biosphere stewardship was to build trust between early on the scientists and the companies. Essentially, the learning is multi-directional. That means that the learning happens from science to business. It happens between companies, peer learning, and it also happens from business to science. The challenges are complex, which calls for diverse capacities and expertise. We're going back to the point of interdisciplinary. CBOS is starting to generate results. We're moving from words to action and hopefully from action to results. And it's starting to inspire others in different sectors and to mobilize those kind of cooperation across the same theory of change. While it started as a science business initiative, it's increasingly connecting to other existing initiatives, including in the policy sphere and in the NGO as well, to build on existing effort and catalyze them. And the key there that has been essential is the scientific funding of it. It's been the evidence base of the initiative. Now, as much as this sounds promising, to some extent, we like to frame it as an experiment and to remind ourselves that here we being scientists are testing a hypothesis, whether those companies have a will and the capacity to actually lead change in their industry towards something more sustainable. And I think only time will tell, even though it's already been 5 years, whether we succeed there. It remains an experiment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste, for this inspiring and stimulating contribution. So we have now time for debate. And so I start with my question, and then Sarah, I give you the floor. I'm wondering, Jean-Baptiste, if you integrate the civil society in your approach, and maybe we could imagine that it would be useful to also promote a strong science civil society collaboration to counterbalance the huge power of transnational companies. And for example, where NGOs did NGOs take part in your Keystone dialogue? How do you manage this? The empowerment of civil society to counterbalance the power of transnational companies.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a really good point. So I'm going to start by the last one, which is that early on NGOs were not around the table. So the very first dialogue was just scientists and the CEOs. And it's somehow, if you read between the lines, it was almost a prerequisite by the companies to kind of join, because I think they have an experience of engaging with NGOs in different forums. So if we were to propose something different, they were quite keen on having this strong link between science and industries early on, without necessarily the usual pressure they are used to from NGOs around the table. Now, that was early on, and that's what I refer to as trust building, I think. But as the initiative evolved and became more institutionalized, we've increasingly partnered with NGOs and different initiatives. So I think now there's a really strong push and connection with NGOs, among other, and with other actors of the civil societies, whether it's different industry-led initiative, different NGO-led initiatives, as well as policy forums like the UN Global Compact or the high-level panel for sustainable ocean, with like 15 head of states now committing to 100% sustainable ocean use. So I think it has evolved over time. Early on, no NGO, very little civil society. Increasingly now, civil society is putting pressure and bringing it to the forefront. Ultimately, and that would be my point to your first aspect of the question, I think that shifting towards stewardship, or accelerating stewardship, or shifting towards a more sustainable practices does require a collaborative and collective effort across the entire value chain. And I think that means, from policymakers and regulators to businesses, and that's what the piece we're trying to do with here is engaging with private sector, but also consumer awareness and citizen science, as well as the role of financiers. Because if it's about creating incentives, you can think of, you know, the policymakers creating the right incentives for the financiers to themselves incentivize better practices. So it really is kind of an all hands on deck situation where I don't think any of those approach is exclusive to each other, but rather should be seen as complementary. It's just a different angle given the urgency of the situation.
Okay, thank you. Then Sarah Fernandez has a question. Then Karl Matthias.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. So stewardship is what, according to what you said, about care, knowledge, and agency. But of course, what we have seen of big corporations up to now, particularly if we think of oil production, for example, is rather doubt, fabric, lobbying, or denial. So it's a little bit without thinking of, at one point, confrontation or, I don't know, trials or local conflicts. It's a little bit hard to imagine what, in fact, what is the logic that make these companies really willing to take care, in a way, of a biosphere or of an ecosystem. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more what really happened with the specific case of the ocean and all the companies related to fish production, which maybe is different. Maybe they have also, I don't know, an interest to make sure they can continue their activity. And I was wondering if you looked at precedents in terms of stewardship, because there has been a water stewardship by big companies, for example, that are related to food and beverage production, with Coca-Cola and lots of Unilever that I've seen, etc., etc. And so there is a history already of this kind of collaboration, and I guess that it would be interesting first to see what it has actually produced before really thinking of the promises of such a proposition.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Jean-Baptiste?
Yeah, thank you. So correct me if I misunderstood. Sometimes it was hard to, the sound doesn't come very clearly, but the first part of your question, if I understood it right, was about why would they care? In summary, I see someone nodding, so I'll take that for a yes. And I think
yes,
this is a very legitimate question.
And doubt
Sorry?
fabric.
Okay, go on, Jean-Baptiste.
Yeah. So like the point here, I think is as I was saying, it's a very legitimate question. It's probably one I've woken every morning over the past 5 years with, wondering the same thing. And I think the answer here is that it's going to depend. And it's certainly going to depend on your sectors. And I think what's very specific with the seafood industry is that it's a renewable resource. So those companies have an understanding of a long-term survival of their business depending on a healthy ocean. There's no alternative to that. I think it's much harder if you look at offshore oil and gas or oil and gas companies, fossil fuels companies in general, right? Because the rationale here and the incentives is very different. It's not a long-term survival of their current operation. It really has to be a transition. And that's what we're starting to see now, where they are trying desperately to find a way to somehow exit with dignity by kind of transitioning to renewable energies, because that's their only survival today, given the current course of decarbonization and policy making. So I think these incentives are going to be sector specific, and they're going to depend on your different context. In the case of seafood, those companies are well aware of climate change. They didn't wait for us to come to the table and explain to them the impact of climate change. They could see it for several decades already on the impact on their production. There's also the reputational pressure and consumer awareness. So at the time we engaged for the first time in 2015, you had a massive scandal of slavery in the Thai seafood industry, with occurrences of forced labor and migrants being chained on board of vessels. no company wants to be associated with that. So that could also have been a trigger early on to engage and to try to solve those issues. The third dimension is that companies, given we're facing complex challenges, I think companies are aware that there are some challenges that they cannot solve alone, but that they could solve together. And this is really at the heart of those kind of science industry initiative, is to try to bring together different actors who collectively and based on science could have an impact that they couldn't on their own. And last but not least, I think it goes back to the overarching landscape of incentives. I think, if anything, looking at the role of financiers, for instance, and the request and the needs and the awareness of shareholders and banks, increasingly, not enough, but increasingly in terms of requiring disclosure and incentivizing better practices, not because the companies want to do it or suddenly woke up to the realization that they needed to be more sustainable, but simply because they won't access capital unless they actually do change. And we're seeing it in EU. We've heard about the EU taxonomy, among others, trying to create that framework of defining what would be a sustainable activities. So again, there is no clear answer to your question, if not the fact that it has to come from all different angles. And it's that collective pressure from different stakeholders that might set them in motion.
Okay.
Finally, just for the...
Quickly, please.
Yeah, super quickly, for the absolutely to acknowledging the history of stewardship, but I would point out the relative failure of it then. I mean, you took Coca-Cola as an example. It's well known, their ambitions for recycling and so on. So I think it hasn't been enough. So whatever happened so far has not been enough. And I think we need more than that.
Okay, thank you. And we have some time left? Or?
Yes, we have.
Yeah. So, Matthias, you can ask your question.
Yeah. Karl Matthias Wansen, UNESCO Chair for River Culture. First place, thank you very much for this very inspiring talk, because it is so straightforward. You identify a problem, you define a scientific framework, and then you deliver practical solutions. This is really fascinating. And I have 3 short questions in this context. First, you mentioned multi-dimensional communication between different stakeholders, but I think you forgot one point, the scientist communication. I think your example is right and should be communicated, not only about the contents, but also about the mechanisms that have been applied there. We see that in ocean science, people generally think big, and in territorial, continental, terrestrial sciences, or also in inland water sciences, people have much smaller dimensions of thought. And I would really appreciate if you could give some points how to improve this communication. The point number 2 is, you were talking about food, and it is obvious, you mentioned it already, the food companies are dealing with climate change, but they are also threatened, for example, by offshore mining that are destroying reproduction sites or feeding sites for fish. So is there a kind of spin-off from your initiative to others? And the last question is about greenwashing, how to control it. I know some background about offshore or marine fisheries. There is in Jamaica, there is one international commission that is dealing with the use of offshore resources, which is totally under, they do not have enough people. The European Union observers on fisheries, they are threatened and their families are threatened if they do not report correctly to Marine Stewardship Council and so on. So how can we achieve an international liability to this, so that the rules that these people pretend to maintain or to keep are really kept and are really controlled?
Thank you, Matthias. Jean-Baptiste, if you could be very concise in your answer.
Is that a way of saying I wasn't before? No. No. Okay, I got the message.
Even more.
No, I mean it's a set of really interesting questions. So we would need much more time, and maybe we can follow up afterwards. I think the first one on communication, I really agree with that, and we like to frame the work that we're doing within CBOS as the science for CBOS, which is the scientific information and evidence we provide and we bring to the table to the companies, but also the science of CBOS. And that's us monitoring the process and learning from and communicating. So across the years of the initiative, we're trying as much as we can to publish, not necessarily on what we give the companies, but more on the process. And we have a different set of scientists that are well-versed in actually studying scientists that study us as well to try to understand that process. And I think this notion of communication is essential from that perspective. It's to have this multiple dimension and to learn. The point of the science of CBOS is for others to learn from it. The second point on interaction between sectors is a really valid one, and that's one that's captured by the Blue Acceleration as well, right? All those trends show you that if within each sector you have those aspirations for growth, and that's not going to add up ultimately. And I think that goes back to the different incentives of different sectors. I think, and this ultimately will be back to an integrated marine spatial planning, where that's the role of policymakers to try to understand how those different activities can take place in a sustainable and equitable way. And that goes beyond industry to include local communities and traditional users of the ocean space. It's a big challenge, not least because 2/3 of the ocean lies beyond national jurisdiction, which is quite unique to the ocean domain compared to land in a way. And that makes governance of that seascape very challenging. The last one is probably the hardest. It's the greenwashing one. How to control for greenwashing one. I don't have the secret recipe. I think it's a constant battle. What helps is to hold companies accountable. And the more they're engaged in those kind of initiatives, the more they are pushed to disclose information. So I think disclosure, traceability, and transparency are one step towards accountability. You need to be transparent and to have a traceable supply chain to be able to be held accountable, be it by regulators, be it by scientists, or be it by civil societies. And that's what we're hoping for. Last but not least, it's the time-bound goals. I think 5 years ago, it was a big step for companies to come together and commit to things without any kind of target quantified or to time-bound goals. I think a step towards controlling greenwashing is to push that towards time-bound goals and quantified metrics, which is now where we are. So we moved from words to action, not yet from action to results per se.
Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste. And now I will give the floor to Leire Escagedo. Apologies for the pronunciation. And